Something big is moving in the Caribbean. The United States has deployed its most advanced aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, into the Caribbean Sea and launched a new military campaign called Operation Southern Spear. Officially, the mission is about hunting narco-terrorists and stopping drug boats headed toward U.S. shores. But its timing and its targets are pulling Washington and Venezuela dangerously close to open war. At the same time, Venezuela's government, led by President Nicolás Maduro, is quietly preparing for something very different: a long guerrilla war on its own soil if U.S. forces ever cross the border. This isn't the first time a U.S. president has used a small Latin American country to send a message to the world, and to his own voters. You're watching Founders and Fortunes. In this episode, we'll look at how George H.W. Bush's invasion of Panama in 1989 reshaped his image at home, and why some analysts now fear that Donald Trump is tempted to replay that script in Venezuela in a far more dangerous setting. To understand today's standoff with Venezuela, we have to go back almost 4 decades, to the late 1980s. In October 1987, Newsweek ran a now famous cover story titled "George Bush, Fighting the Wimp Factor." The article argued that Bush, then Ronald Reagan's vice president and a 1988 presidential hopeful, suffered from a perception problem. Many Americans saw him as too soft, too cautious, not tough enough to handle the presidency. This reputation followed Bush into the White House. He took office in January 1989 with a job approval rating around 51%, respectable but not overwhelming. On paper, Bush was anything but weak. He had served in Congress, at the United Nations, as chairman of the Republican National Committee, as CIA director, and as vice president. But the wimp factor label stuck, and the media amplified it. Many voters saw Bush as a careful manager, not a bold leader. That perception would change in one dramatic operation: the U.S. invasion of Panama. By the late 1980s, General Manuel Noriega was the de facto dictator of Panama. He had long-standing ties with U.S. intelligence, but he was also deeply involved in drug trafficking and had become politically toxic in Washington. In 1988, U.S. federal grand juries indicted him on drug trafficking and money laundering charges. In May 1989, Panamanians went to the polls. Opposition candidate Guillermo Endara appeared to win the presidential election by a wide margin. Noriega simply annulled the results. The U.S. responded by reinforcing its forces in the Panama Canal Zone and increasing pressure on the regime. Tensions escalated through the year. On December 15, 1989, Panama's National Assembly declared that a state of war existed with the United States. 2 days later, Panamanian troops shot and killed a U.S. Marine lieutenant at a roadblock and assaulted another U.S. officer and his wife. Those incidents became the trigger for action. In the early hours of December 20, 1989, President Bush ordered Operation Just Cause, a large-scale invasion of Panama. Around 27,000 U.S. troops took part, quickly overwhelming the roughly 16,000-strong Panamanian Defense Forces. Officially, Washington listed 4 main objectives: protect the lives of U.S. citizens in Panama, defend democracy and human rights, combat drug trafficking, and safeguard the Panama Canal Treaties, which committed the U.S. to hand over full control of the canal by the end of 1999. Critics, however, argued that those were convenient justifications. They pointed out that the U.S. had tolerated Panama's lack of democracy for years and had itself helped Noriega rise to power and stay there when it suited American interests. On the ground, the operation moved fast. Major combat operations lasted only a few days. Noriega evaded capture at first, then took refuge in the Vatican's diplomatic mission in Panama City. After a tense standoff, he surrendered on January 3, 1990, and was flown to Miami to stand trial. In 1992, A U.S. court convicted Noriega on multiple counts of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering and sentenced him to 40 years in prison, later reduced for good behavior. The human cost in Panama is still debated. Official Pentagon figures put Panamanian deaths at around 516, including roughly 314 soldiers and 202 civilians. Other estimates range higher, and the United Nations and human rights groups criticize the invasion as a violation of international law. U.S. forces lost 23 troops in the fighting. Politically, though, the operation was a clear win for Bush at home. His approval rating surged from the low 50s to around 80% by January 1990, one of the highest readings in Gallup's history. For many Americans, Bush had gone from wimp to decisive commander-in-chief in less than a month. Now jump to 2025. President Donald Trump, back in the White House, is under intense pressure at home over the release of Jeffrey Epstein-related emails and looming Epstein files legislation in Congress. Newly disclosed messages from Epstein's estate suggest Trump knew about the girls, while still stopping short of accusing him of direct involvement. The White House calls the release a partisan smear, and Trump himself has labeled the whole controversy the Jeffrey Epstein hoax. Against that backdrop, the administration has dramatically escalated military operations around Venezuela. Since late summer 2025, the U.S. has built up a powerful naval presence in the southern Caribbean. This includes the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, backed by destroyers, submarines, and aircraft. U.S. forces have already carried out more than 20 airstrikes on boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, which Washington describes as drug smuggling vessels linked to Venezuelan-connected cartels. Dozens of people have been killed. On November 13, 2025, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth formally unveiled Operation Southern Spear, led by Joint Task Force Southern Spear and U.S. Southern Command. The operation uses a new hybrid fleet of crewed ships and robotic sea and air systems to detect and destroy suspected drug trafficking networks across the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Publicly, the message is simple. This is a war on narco-terrorists, not on Venezuela. But the details tell a more complicated story. Trump has repeatedly described Venezuela as a narco-state. His administration has designated the Venezuelan Tren de Aragua gang a terrorist organization. And officials have tied some of the targeted boats to networks allegedly connected to President Nicolás Maduro. Analysts note that the scale of the deployment and the nature of the hardware, carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, look more like preparations for a regional conflict than a purely police-style anti-drug operation. Publicly, Trump denies planning regime change in Venezuela, insisting that the goal is to stop drugs and protect Americans. But reporting from major outlets points to internal discussions of possible strikes on targets inside Venezuela and covert CIA operations on Venezuelan soil. The question many observers now ask is simple. Is Operation Southern Spear just about drug boats, or is it the opening move in a campaign to topple Maduro? Venezuela is not ignoring the threat. Recently leaked Venezuelan planning documents describe a strategy of prolonged resistance if U.S. forces ever attack. The idea is not to fight a conventional war that would be hopeless against the U.S. military, but to turn Venezuela into a grinding, years-long insurgency. The plan has two main pillars: guerrilla warfare. Small Venezuelan military units and militias would disperse into around 280 locations, focusing on sabotage, ambushes, and hit-and-run attacks against any occupying force. Organized chaos in cities. Intelligence services and armed supporters of the ruling party would work to make key cities, especially Caracas, effectively ungovernable for any foreign-backed or opposition-backed authority. Maduro claims that up to 8 million civilians are being trained to use weapons as part of militias that would resist a foreign invasion. Independent experts say this number is likely exaggerated, and that the real number of armed, organized supporters is far smaller, but still large enough to complicate any occupation. Venezuela is already awash in weapons. Estimates of civilian gun ownership range from 1 to 6 million firearms, many of them illegal, accumulated over years of smuggling and weak law enforcement. For Trump's allies, a strike might seem like a quick operation, but Venezuelan planners are clearly thinking about Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, wars where the invasion was easy, but the occupation was costly and politically disastrous. Some parallels between Panama in 1989 and Venezuela in 2025 exist. Both leaders were accused by Washington of drug trafficking. Both faced U.S. sanctions. Both conflicts were framed as protecting democracy and U.S. citizens, but the differences are huge. Size and geography. Panama in 1989, 2.5 million people, compact territory. Venezuela today, 28 to 30 million people, twice the size of Iraq, with jungles, mountains, savannas, and a long coastline. Occupying Panama took weeks. Occupying Venezuela could take years. U.S. footprint. In Panama, the U.S. already had bases and thousands of troops. In Venezuela, the U.S. has no bases. Any invasion would require a massive amphibious or airborne assault. Regional politics. In 1989, Latin America largely tolerated the Panama invasion. In 2025, regional powers like Colombia and Brazil are wary, while Russia and China have strong interests in Venezuelan oil and may support Caracas. Oil. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, around 303 billion barrels. Panama had no comparable resource stakes. Maduro has reportedly offered the U.S. expanded oil access in exchange for relief, but the Trump administration has rejected these offers. Panama had a clear objective: remove Noriega and secure the canal. Venezuela would involve oil politics, great power rivalry, and a population highly sensitive to foreign intervention. There is also an uncomfortable parallel. Bush's invasion of Panama helped erase the Wimp factor and pushed his approval to 80%. Trump faces the Epstein controversy and other domestic pressures at the very moment Operation Southern Spear launches. Critics argued that a bold foreign operation could shift the public narrative, while Trump's team insists this is purely about stopping drugs and keeping Americans safe. Both things could be true at the same time. So where does that leave us? On one side, the U.S., a carrier strike group, robotic fleets, and a president who has already authorized lethal strikes on suspected cartel boats. On the other side, Venezuela, nearly 30 million people, difficult terrain, armed militias, and a government preparing for years of guerrilla resistance. Panama was quick. Venezuela could become a long, grinding conflict, a new forever war in the Western Hemisphere. Do you think President Trump is willing to risk a Venezuelan quagmire, militarily and politically, as just scrutiny over Epstein and domestic problems grows? And if he does, how far will Russia and China go to keep Maduro in power? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.